Hello. As you may have seen labelled on this video, this is part 2 of Horror Nights history for HHN 13, Halloween Horror Nights 13 from the year 2003. However, you might notice I'm dressed differently and am a little more cleanly shaven than in part 1 or in part 3 when you see that. And you may be scratching your head saying, well, those look like they were filmed on the same night, but this one seems to have been filmed on some other occasion. And you may ponder the mystery of that. And I will give you now a little explanation as to why this was made afterwards, to replace the original part 2. Yes, I had originally started out as, this is part 2, the sequel! Following up on the whole movie theme with the director, who was the icon that year. And that was very clever. At least I hoped it was clever. But now it's going to be the remake of part 2. Yes, it's a remake of a sequel. My goodness, just like the sort of crap that comes out of Hollywood nowadays, where they do such things. But and remake remakes and God knows what else, the unoriginal idiots. But let's get to the explanation so I don't use up all the time that I have allotted to me to try to refill what I said before. Essentially, in the course of describing the lovely Scare Zone Island night prey, which we'll get to soon, I talked about the characters in there who are presented as sort of primitive jungle dwelling tribal people, and in so doing I used a word, in all innocence, because I saw these people who were primarily in fact, they were, I think, completely played by Caucasians. They were actually all rather blonde, and thus I had no other thought than that they were happy little jungle woodland creatures, woodland creatures hopping about in a frisky and frolicsome way in this rainforest environment. And so in describing them, I described them using a little animal that might hop around and suddenly realized that that terminology was used by those people who have, prejudices and bigotry against certain ethnic groups as a racial slur. And catching that immediately, I tried to make sure that the viewing audience understood that no such insensitiveness, no such intention was there, and but I realized nevertheless that there are still some who just hearing the word would become offended by it, and regardless of the context or intention otherwise. And so I determined that it would probably be best for all concerned if I simply discarded that first take and then do this new one. And so there we are. Hopefully it will not be a problem for anyone. So, therefore, I was talking in part 1 about the brochure. Yes, which I have here, the first brochure I have saved. So let's take a look at it, shall we? And inside, you see, they were already doing Express Pass in 2003, although I didn't use it then because I was still, although already in my early 40s, actually I was 40 years old that year, I still had been fairly fit and trim. I gained a couple pounds since the previous year, but I was still feeling pretty fit and trim. I didn't mind standing online for long periods of time. And I could always come back another night and check out anything I'd missed, so I wasn't very interested. There was a little ad for the t-shirt, just in case you didn't bother to look in a shop. They would let you know there was a t-shirt in the brochure, so it'd be very good to go back and buy one. And then, of course, we have the great map inside. But on the back here, they also talked about Frequent Fear Pass, which was going on. Back then, you got a little card with your picture on it, little picture ID, just like the at that time is how they used to do the annual passes as well. So if you had your Frequent Fear Pass, you could have your own little insane picture that you could show people. Here's the map, which showed all the islands that were that year, and very nicely displayed for you where you could find everything. It was quite lovely, as I said. So that was the little brochure, and that concludes all the stuff I got as souvenirs that year. So let us go ahead and continue with the different islands that we had, which once again became scare zones for the event. And once again we'll do that same clockwise rotation just as if we had entered the park in the early evening and were told to go in that direction by the anxious Universal employees. So we start then with Port of Entry, which once again was renamed Port of Evil, the same name they used in 2002. But this one was quite different. Of course, you didn't have the caretaker lurking about. No, you had 13 everywhere, of course. It was even in the mist, 13 projected onto the misty things. And when you went up through, you came toward the lagoon where there was a huge a sort of set piece that was almost, you know, very powerful, with a skull, a gigantic skull with the number 13 right on, and torches. And from this sort of ritual altar-like, there would be, the director would be there during the opening ceremony, and sometimes he'd be there again at other times during the event to inaugurate Halloween Horror Nights 13, but also you'd have various creepy characters lurking about. They were primarily stilt walkers, were the most memorable characters, although they had shorter things running, scuttling about so that they can get you from both directions in the same time, which is always a neat effect. Well, those stilt walkers included demonic characters, and if you're familiar with your demonology, say you go back and read some medieval tomes written by Roman Catholic monks in the Middle Ages to explain every single demon that exists and how they tempt you for every single possible sin, which they were very curious and important to study this, there was a thing called an incubus, and another thing called a succubus. The plural of these words were incubi and succubi, because of course we're speaking Latin. That was the official language of the Roman Church in those days, and still is actually. And the succubus, the incubus, is supposed to be a demon that appears in the fine form of a handsome young man and appears in the bedchamber of a virgin or maiden and seduces her to lose her maidenhead with him that night, and then is revealed to be a fiend from hell. And the same thing with the succubus, except she would, of course, prey not so much on young male virgins as much as, well, holy men of the church who had taken a vow of celibacy and chastity, and therefore should never do any naughty thing, but would tempt them with salacious, lascivious females, who would then, of course, transform into hags or demonic demonesses to reveal that they had seduced them into sin. And primarily in the case of the succubus, the church said this is the way that the devil would, in the incubus, excuse me, this is the way the devil would conjoin with those women who worshipped him, as they believed that witches were worshippers of Satan, and they persecuted anyone who practiced the old religion as if they were devil worshippers and burnt them at the stake. But in the case of the succubus, they believed that this would explain the phenomenon that occurred to these monks and priests, because anyone who abstains from all sexual activity is going to start having sexual things happen while they're sleeping at night. They'll get aroused, they'll have nocturnal emissions and sexual dreams, and they could only explain that this would happen. The only explanation for them would be demons from hell tempting them to sin. That was the only thing they could think of, and so that's the explanation they came up with. Well, our incubus was named Ravana, and he was all white flesh with these strange fleshy things around his neck. Very creepy, but rather regal. And the succubi were similarly tall on stilts with horns and red's flesh, and again very sexy, with a little sort of a lot of décolletage, cleavage, whatever you want to call it, on display. And these people were there, and they also had another stilt walking character called the Sentinel. It was a strange sort of bald figure with the mouth sewn shut with the number 13, but stripped to the waist with this long spike. These characters, some of these we saw this year at Halloween Horror Nights 20. The Succubus and the Sentinel both appeared at the Scares on Hollywood Boulevard, so for those who missed 2003. But Ravana did not make an appearance this year. Alright, so let's move on to the next island, Marvel Comics superhero island became Toxic City, because of course Marvel was still upset about what had happened the year before, and people at Universal decided not to touch Marvel Comics, but they put a scare zone there that was a toxic waste explosion, and a huge tank of toxic waste that was all burnt and blackened on the top as you entered. It had exploded and spewed all sorts of toxic waste over the entire city, mutating the inhabitants, not like the X-Men, but more like Chud or some other thing. Faces melting off, and foam was all over the streets, and as you went through, the substance would cause you to mutate, and they would try to contaminate you so that you too would become a hideous, grotesque creature. Then, if you went on into Toon Lagoon, that became Hide and Shriek! And yes, it was not Hide and Shriek, but Hide and Shriek! And you could tell by the way it was written. Well, I'm not going to do that, but it had 3 E's and an exclamation point at the end of Shriek, just to let you know it's not Shriek, but Shriek. And they used some of the similar techniques that they had used in various haunted houses up to this. I've talked about some of them. The sort of funhouse disorienting type of effects, and they would take characters and put them in like tights with a full face cover mask and put a pattern or design on it that matched the background. They'd have like walls and set pieces scattered about Toon Lagoon, and the character would be up against it, and supposedly they would blend in so perfectly with the background, chameleon-like, that you wouldn't notice them until it was too late and they lurched down at you. Thus they would hide and then jump out and make you shriek. That's the raison d'etre of that. Alright, so you go beyond that, you come to Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park was transformed into Night Prey. And the idea this year is that you're in some sort of lost world, like in those old funky movies from the 50s where they had, you know, white people playing natives somewhere in a lost civilization. They had these people in their loincloths and little bikinis with all the various, you know, jungle type of, you know, beads and bones and things, whatever you'd expect such people to have. And they were sort of frolicking about as this tribe of cannibals or whatever they were, while simultaneously horrible pterodactyl-like dinosaur creatures were lurking about as well. So you would be stalked by both of these. The natives were used more as sort of a distraction than they were the actual scare so much, because they would have the pedestals that the very attractive young men and women would be on, doing the jungle go-go dance, and you would watch them, and because they picked very fine young men and women to portray these characters, you would find yourself, regardless of your particular preferences, one of them would get your attention, maybe both if you're swinging both ways, who knows, and you would be looking at them and going, wow, and thinking about putting a dollar bill in their loincloth while the reptilian beast was coming up behind you to nail you from behind. Universal hasn't done the distraction scare of the, you know, attractive character to get your attention away from the monster coming up on you for a while now, but they did it quite a bit in the early years, and this was one of the more effective times they did so. And of course there was all these drums and sort of music that would remind you of the old jungle movies from way back when. And I'm beginning to think now that maybe Universal specifically cast people of European descent in these parts just so they could avoid any racial connotations, because it's become almost a stereotype or cliche, or even, you know, almost considered a bit racist, those old movies when they had you know, the African or South American natives, you know, presented as primitives, and, you know, and the colonial with his pith helmet would come in and, oh, these native types are superstitious and primitive, oh, aren't we superior? And it's a bit racist, actually. So by making them all white people, you totally eliminate that. And that was a clever idea indeed. Yeah, now that I think about it, I think that might be what it was. And to avoid the naughty word that I used on the original version, which was, you know, totally unintended for any offense, but I would now use a better terminology to get the same idea across. They were sort of like happy little jungle puppies or jungle kittens as they frolicked about in like some grown-up refugees from Lord of the Flies or something of that type, or, you know, worshipping she in one of these old movies, you know, presenting this sort of theme. And now we've run out of time, and hopefully this will not offend anybody, as it will supersede the previous entry, and we can go on to the older one that I already made, which is part 3.